Middle and upper class, doctors and lawyers, run the banks in Hollywood. Working class people and poor people, lazy, uneducated, sloppy, and they eat Spam and Velveeta, right? Me, growing up a working class Jew, not doctors and lawyers, and we're not eating Spam because we're kosher, right? So we can't be white trash. Well, I'm thinking we're kosher trash. But where were the voices today of the kosher trash, the poor and the working class Jews? Because if I heard about them, it was about giving tzedakah, defined as charity, which of course is a good thing to do. But where was the tzedakah of justice for poor and working class Jews? And I asked myself that question when I was reading an article called The Good News and Bad News about Jews and Money. And in the beginning of the article, it said, we as Jews should be proud that only about 10% of the Jewish population live at or below the poverty level. And then pretty much for the rest of the article, it said that we as Jews sometimes feel guilty about our prosperity and our success because of stereotypes about Jews and money. But that we should feel proud of our success. And I guess they mean the success of 90% of the Jews, because they kind of never talk about that 10% of Jews again, or what success might look like for them. And it sounds like almost we are ashamed of them, and that we are excluding them, and they were me. And I was pretty familiar about how it felt to be excluded for being more or less 10% of the population. Because people anecdotally at least say that 10% of the population is queer, and I'm a lesbian. And it wasn't that long ago that queers were excluded from most places in the Jewish community and elsewhere. And I didn't want to exclude 10% of the population. And you know what? It's actually more than 10% of the Jewish population, because a recent Pew study says that 20% of Jewish households live with incomes below $30,000. And some people say it's more. And I didn't want to exclude people. We don't have a tradition of excluding people. We have a tradition of including people, of welcoming the stranger, of building community. So I thought about this story in Exodus. And one of the first things that the communal task that the Jews were told to do was to build a sanctuary, a Mishkan. And Moshe is told that holiness doesn't just dwell in this one place in the Mishkan, and it doesn't even just dwell with a couple of holy people. Moshe is told that holiness will dwell amongst them. And it says that everyone contributes to the Mishkan whose heart makes them bring forth for every kind of work. And they talk about carpenters and sewers and schleppers and weavers. All kinds of workers contribute. But when I think today about where we are as a Jewish community in terms of Jews in class, it's not the story of the Mishkan I think about. It's building King Solomon's temple. Because King Solomon's temple was supposed to be a way to recreate or try to recreate the Mishkan. And King Solomon, he was known to be a wise king. But actually, King Solomon's temple was built using agricultural taxes and the forced labor of Jews, mas. It's the same word they used to describe what the Pharaoh imposed upon the Jews in Egypt. King Solomon's temple was a top-down organization, not a community effort like the Mishkan. But despite how it was built, King Solomon is told that it's possible for holiness to dwell amongst them. It's possible for it to become like a Mishkan if the people obey the laws and the commandments, if we embrace Jewish values and ethics, like looking deeper at tzedakah as justice. And this is a lesson I tried to teach my son when he was younger. He used to sometimes do his homework in my office while I was working. And above my desk, I have a poster and it has a quote from an Australian activist, and it says, "If you've come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together." And my son, easily distracted from his homework, would often say to me, "Amy, why is it bad to help people?" And I'd say, "My Chai, it's not bad to help people, it's good to help people. But we need to understand, sometimes you help them, and then sometimes they help you, and you work together on a project or a goal." And that would sometimes satisfy him for an entire 10 minutes. And sometimes a whole month would go by. But we'd always come back to that question: why is it bad to help people? And I needed to ask myself, do I know? Because I have a relative, she's a single mom with a few kids. And when her kids were young, she worked in a donut shop for minimum wage. And I knew it was really hard, and I tried to help her financially, and I was sympathetic that she had this yucky job. And I thought, oh, I'm building a Mishkan. But actually, I was stuck in King Solomon's temple. Because she was visiting once, and another friend of mine was there, and when my friend heard that she worked in the donut shop, she said to her, "You must have to work so hard and know so much to work in that donut shop." And her eyes lit up. And she said, "I do." She said, "I have to be really strong and lift heavy trays of hot steaming donuts. I have to talk to everyone from men in business suits to junkies, and I give them advice. I laugh at their jokes. Sometimes I'm even a bouncer. I work hard. I know a lot." And I thought, well, sure, I had helped her. I was even sympathetic, but did I really respect who she was as a person and what she knew and what she could bring to our community? And I asked, do we in our community know that? Do we know the difference between helping someone and respecting them? Between tzedakah as charity and tzedakah as justice? Between King Solomon's temple and the Mishkan? What does that look like? Well, in King Solomon's temple, when we're trying to learn about labor issues, maybe we ask someone who studies labor history to come talk to us, and that's great. But in the Mishkan, we understand that we need to ask maybe a fast food worker what their knowledge is. When we're in King Solomon's temple and we're teaching a group of children about poor and working class Jews, maybe we talk about the Jews at the turn of the 20th century and how they worked at sweatshops. And that's great. They need to know that history. But in the Mishkan, we understand that there might be children in that classroom whose families work in today's sweatshops. And we say to them, what can you teach us about working class and poor Jews today? When we're in King Solomon's temple and we're doing tzedakah, maybe we have food drives or clothing drives, and that's really, really important, holy, needed work. But in the Mishkan, we understand that it's not just about helping those people over there, but how poor and working class Jews are part of our community, respecting and honoring their skills. Maybe we particularly ask poor and working class Jews to be on our finance committees. I'm sure you all know that poor and working class people have a reputation for being really good with budgets, right? I was on this job interview once for a management position, and they said, "How are you with budgets?" And I said, "I'm great with budgets," it was a job interview. I said, "I have this experience, and I have this education, and I grew up poor," and everybody laughed. And I said, well, I wasn't actually trying to be funny, because the reality is, when you have to make difficult daily decisions between milk and medicine, between bus fare and rent, you get really good at figuring out a budget quickly. And without the reality of poor and working class Jews in our communities, we will not know how to equitably set budgets for our organizations and synagogues. We may think that equality is good enough. We may say, let's have everybody spend 3% of their income to become a member. Okay, 3% of $200,000, $6,000, it's a lot of money. But the person has $194,000 left over, and it's probably not going to impact their daily survival. 3% of $20,000, $600, way smaller amount. But when every day and every week and every month you are struggling to survive, that could be too much. That can impact your survival. That can exclude you from our communities. And I don't want to exclude people. I want to welcome them. I want to welcome them the way some synagogues have actually started to welcome queers. They call themselves welcoming synagogues. This is particularly to say to queers, we know you've been excluded. We want to include you. Your voices, your lives are important. You are part of our community. That's what I want to do for poor and working class Jews. Because, I don't want to hear just about the financial success of Jews. I want to hear about all kinds of success. I want to hear about how great we treat each other. I want to hear about creative ways that we're creating inclusive communities. And not just focusing on 90% of the Jews like it talked about in that article. I want to hear about all kinds of success of 100% of the Jews. And I know that we can actually tell the difference between King Solomon's temple and the Mishkan every single Shabbat when we sing L'cha Dodi. And I always read the drash in the prayer book, because what the drash says is that during the last verse, the whole congregation, they stand up and they put their back to the altar, to the beamer, so that they can face the entrance in the back of the shul. And there's a Yiddish expression of which this drash is based on. And it says that when we do that, the back becomes the front, because the poor person and the stranger who sits in the back of the shul, they get the honor of welcoming Shabbat first. And it says that Shabbat will only come in peace when the Jewish community respects and honors the people in the back. And I'm not a person who actually cries a lot in their life, but I almost always cry when I read that, because I know that it's my family and my ancestors and the working class and poor Jews and the queer Jews and the others who are disenfranchised, who are sitting in the back of the shul, and sometimes they don't even get to sit in the back of the shul. Sometimes they're in the doorway, and sometimes they're out the door altogether, and that is King Solomon's temple. But then there's this moment where we're all singing together, and I look around, and the backs really become the front, and we're all together. And I think, yeah, there can be justice for poor and working class Jews. And I think holiness can dwell amongst us. And I believe that we can build a new Mishkan. Thank you.